just going over the grocery list. Just joking. Glad to see everybody here tonight. Hope you've had a good afternoon. Good to see everybody back here. I know this morning I gave, I distracted myself with that, but I just got to say, when I was at a church in Texas when I used to do children's ministry, and the pastor there, he was from Georgia, and he just was the funniest guy. And he was in the middle of preaching one time, just preaching his heart out. And he stopped and looked at his wife and he said, "We need eggs and milk." And then just got right back into his sermon and said that, for some reason, I just thought of that when she was telling me something. So I said we're going over our shopping list. Anyway, good to see everybody here tonight. I know this morning I gave a lot of announcements. The bulletins are back there if you did not get one or did not get a newsletter. We've had a lot of donations come in today for Awana, for the Awana store. We appreciate that. If you'd like to donate any candy, especially individually wrapped candy, that is very beneficial. If you could bring that maybe Wednesday night or Sunday morning, we would appreciate that. And maybe you're not able to run to the store or anything, maybe you'd like to give some cash towards that. We appreciate it. That'll all be used for our kids next week. So don't forget, next Sunday night, we will not meet in here. There will still be adult choir practice in here, but everybody will be in the gym. After that, we're going to have, as you see in the newsletter there, our potluck and egg hunt, it says. And I will still do a message over in the other building, kind of, for the kids and with the kids in mind, kind of for everybody. But I'm looking forward to that next week, so please be aware of that. And all the other things that are in your bulletin, all the special choir practices, interpretive movement, sunrise service. Next Sunday morning, a week from today, will be the adults doing their musical in the morning. So a lot of things going on. Look for somebody to invite. We have revival coming up at the beginning of May, so look for people to invite for that. Maybe they go to church somewhere else and they'll come here Monday and Tuesday, or maybe they don't go anywhere and they may come for a special service. So it should be good. Looking forward to all those things. If you have any questions about any of them, please just ask. And otherwise, we'll have a word of prayer and we'll begin our service. I did hear this morning, someone told me that, and now I forgot his name, but Mr. Freeman, Kerry Freeman, if you didn't know, Kerry Freeman passed away a couple of days ago. He was not a member here, but grew up here, I guess, a good part of his life, and had a heart attack a couple of days ago. But do remember his family. Josh Freeman, the pastor at Crestview, that's his uncle, and Steve Freeman, just down the road at Mount Lebanon, I guess. So pray for them and that family. How'd I do? Good. And then also Virginia Babb left choir practice. She got a text about her nephew, which we mentioned last Sunday night about her nephew having been, I'm not sure if it was a heart attack or what it was, and it ended up not being that, but still they took him off of life support yesterday, and the family texted her and said, that she needed to get up there if she wanted to see him again. So she left her in choir practice. So remember Virginia Babb and her family with her nephew James, who may have passed by now, may not. I don't really know any more than that. But please remember them in your prayers. And with that said, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll continue on in our service. Lord, I thank you for another day that you have given to us. I thank you that we can gather here tonight, for being able to come here this morning and worship you, and to do the same thing once again tonight. Lord, I pray that we have a good service in here as we continue with the Sermon on the Mount. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to see how we can be salt and light to this world. Lord, I pray for our kids, and whether they're in preschool or children's choir right now, as they're getting ready for their musical, and I pray that they would learn more about you in the process and have a good time, have fun doing that. Lord, I pray for all the things we have coming up here with our musical on Palm Sunday and all the special things we're doing on Easter, from interpretive movement to the kids singing and all of that stuff. If nothing else, just a day that most people go to church. If they go once or twice a year, it's typically on Easter. And so, Lord, we pray that these will be opportunities for us to present the gospel to a lost and dying world. We pray that salvation would come as a result of it. And maybe some of those who are backslidden or who only come, they know they need to come more often, they just come once or twice a year. Lord, maybe through these things they will come back, repent, and get back to where they know they need to be. So, Lord, we pray over the next few weeks as we have opportunity that we would make the most of the opportunities that we've been given. And Lord, as we go into our revival services too, I pray for Brad that you would anoint him and give him the messages that we need to hear. And I pray that we would pack this place out and invite people, bring people with us, offer them rides or dinner or whatever we have to do to get them here. And Lord, I pray that would be a great week for our church and for this community as well. Lord, I pray for our country, and I pray for our President Trump, and Lord, I pray for our Vice President, and I pray for everybody around them, everybody in D.C., everybody in Columbia, everybody that represents us or makes decisions that affect us. I pray that you give them wisdom. Let them do the right thing in every situation. Lord, I pray for our military. I know we always have people that are sent somewhere, and Lord, I pray that you keep them all safe. We thank you for what they do for us. I pray for our missionaries in whatever capacity they minister, wherever they are. I pray that you keep them all safe. Bless them, Lord, and I pray that they would do great things where they are. Help us as a church to make sure that we do our part to support them and to keep them there and to meet their needs so that they can do what they've been called to do. I pray, though, Lord, as you've called us to be right here in our Jerusalem, that you would help us to reach this Putnam community and Union County at large and the whole upstate. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to be the church that we need to be, and that means being the individuals we need to be who are faithful to honor you with our tithes and offerings, faithful to answer when you lead us to teach a class or to minister or to do something and serve in some way. And Lord, if you give us a vision, I pray that we'd follow through with it and not get hung up on what we might think is impossible, but let us always remember that with you, all things are possible. So we thank you for who you are and all you do for us. We pray for a great night, and I ask this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. We're back in Matthew chapter 5 tonight as we finished up the Beatitudes last week, I guess. And so now, were we here last week? Yeah, we sang. We had the music last week. I knew that didn't seem right. We had our fifth Sunday night music last week, but the week before that, we finished up the Beatitudes. And tonight we're going to move right back into the Sermon on the Mount. So we're in Matthew chapter 5 still, and we're going to be looking at verses 13 to 16. And as you're turning there in Matthew 5, I want you to think about this. If you were to evaporate a ton of water, 2,000 pounds of water, out of the Pacific Ocean, if that water were to evaporate, the salt that would be left behind from a ton of water in the Pacific Ocean would weigh in at 79 pounds of salt, approximately. It sounds like a lot, right? If you were to do the same thing on the Atlantic Ocean, evaporate a ton of water, you would get 81 pounds, 2 more pounds, about 81 pounds of salt from a ton of water in the Atlantic Ocean. If you were to go to the Dead Sea, you would get a whopping 500 pounds of salt by evaporating a ton of water. I say that to tell us something that we probably already know, but different bodies of water, they vary in the amounts of salt that they contain. You go to Atlantic or Pacific and you get slightly different salt contents. You go to the Dead Sea and it's just a completely different situation. Different bodies of water, different amounts of salt. The reason I say that is I believe the same is true of Christians. We have different amounts of salt within each one of us, or a different capacity in our saltiness. What do I mean by that? If you're in Matthew chapter 5, let's read just verses 13 to 16 and see what Jesus says about salt and light. Verses that, I haven't turned my mic on yet, have I? Is it on? How about now? So bad at that. Any difference? Okay, all right. These are verses that are probably familiar to most, if not all of us, but we'll read them again. Jesus says in verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste," or some say flavor, some say savor, "how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all that are in the house. In the same way, let your light so shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven." One of my favorite passages. I've always loved the simple teaching in this little passage that Jesus gives here. In it, he tells his disciples, remember the context, this is not the multitudes. He tells his disciples, possibly 12 people, maybe more than that, we're not exactly sure. But in it, he tells his disciples, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And so the message tonight, we're going to talk about those two words. We're going to talk about salt and light through the course of the message tonight. But before we do, there's two things we need to understand because these are true of both. The Greek structure in these sentences from Jesus, you are the salt, you are the light, we don't see it in English, but it's implied in Greek as in you are the only salt of the earth. You are the only light of the world. In other words, if we weren't here, if the church were not here, if we were to go away, the earth has no other means of getting salt. There would be no other source of light if the church of Jesus Christ was not here. We are not only the salt, we are the only salt. We're not only the light, we are the only light, and therefore it's important that we understand what salt and light is, because we're the only source of it. The second thing that we need to understand is Jesus uses the word are. You are the salt. You are the light. He does not say you can become salt or you can become the light. He says you are. So the question in this passage is not, have you become the light? Or have you become the salt? The question is simply, are you effective? Are you effectively being the light of the world? Are you allowing God's light to shine through you? Are you effectively being the salt of the earth? Are you providing? I know this is distracting. It's weird. So no one's looking at me. Are you the salt of the earth? Are you effectively doing what Jesus wants you to do in order to be the salt of the earth? He says you are the salt. You are the light. So we are. This is not a message on how to become salt or light. It's to ask, are we being effective in our role as salt and light? As I said about different bodies of water, and they vary in their salty content, well, so you and I may vary in the amount of light that we shine. We may vary in the amount of salt that we provide to the earth. I believe Jesus has a goal for us, something he wants us to live up to. You say, how salty do I need to be? How much light do I need to shine? It's not something we can really quantify. It's not something we can really measure, but just to simply ask, am I letting my light so shine? Am I being the salt that this world so desperately needs me to be? So as we go through and look at these two simple words tonight, keep that question in mind. Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Am I being effective in that? So number one, let's talk about salt. We already saw it in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. And as he continues in that verse, he tells them that if your salt is no longer effective, if the salt has lost its value, how can it be salted again? How can it regain its flavor? It can't. Once salt is no longer useful, it's good for nothing, Jesus says, not fulfilling its very purpose. So that's what I want you to ask yourself as we talk about salt. Am I fulfilling my purpose? Or have I lost all usefulness? I think that's an incredibly sad state for a Christian to find themselves in, to say, you know what, I've lost my usefulness to Christ. But I don't believe anybody's too far gone if that's the case. I believe we can always repent and become useful once again. But Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. So let's talk about salt. Salt has a lot of value. What do we do with salt? Here in America, what's our number one use for salt? We put it in little shakers, and we put it on our table. We put it beside the oven. We put it somewhere in the kitchen when we cook. It's on every restaurant or booth when you go into somewhere to eat. It's in those little tiny packets, which just frankly doesn't give you near enough. Am I right? Can I get a witness on that? We put salt everywhere because we use it for our food. That's probably the first thing we think of. Many of us, when they bring that plate of food to the table, before we've even tasted to see if it needs salt, we've already reached for that salt shaker. We've put fries on our salt on our fries. We've put salt on our French fries, and they didn't even need salt to start with. We don't even taste it. We salt it before it comes. I do that at El Poblano on the chips. Anybody salt their chips at the Mexican restaurants? And see, y'all just need help. Look, next time y'all go out for Mexican food, when they bring the chips, just sprinkle a little salt. You'll thank me later, okay? If you don't get anything else out of the message, salt your chips at El Poblano, all right? That's a joke. But I do that. I know these chips are better with salt, so I always salt the chips. And we do that. It makes our food taste better. Imagine eating a potato with no salt. Mashed potato, baked potato, no salt. How's it going to taste? Bland, right? Not going to have that flavor. So we salt our food. But when Jesus said this, I don't think his disciples were thinking about food. I don't think they were thinking about the flavor in their food, because salt was far more valuable than just making bland food taste better. Salt had many different purposes. So I'm going to talk about some of those different purposes right now. But think about to the Romans. Jesus was speaking to Greek people, but they were under Roman occupation, and so they certainly knew what the Romans thought about life. The Romans valued salt to be the second most important thing in the world. Number one was the sun. Number two was salt. The Greeks, to whom Jesus was speaking here, the Greeks used the Greek word theon, which is where we get our word for God or divine. when they spoke of salt. Their word for salt was literally divine. They viewed salt as being so important that it was as if it was from God himself. And that's the word that they used for it. The Romans would actually pay their soldiers and other types of occupations would do it. They would pay them in salt. They would get money, but salt was a fringe benefit. People worked for salt. That's where we get the expression today about somebody being worth his salt. They say, oh, he's not worth his salt. It means he's not doing his job well enough to get paid. Salt was so important, they almost used it for currency. They paid people in this stuff. Why was it so important? We're going to see some of the values of it. The first thing, though, that we notice about salt is its color. Salt is white, which is often associated with purity, the color white. And so many have looked at this passage. Jesus says, you're the salt of the earth, and they say, well, salt is white, it's pure, and it actually has purifying qualities to it. And so maybe Jesus is telling us that we need to be pure. And I think that's certainly fine. We can make an application with that. Because what did he just finish saying in the Beatitudes? Blessed are the pure in heart. He had already told them that they needed to be pure. And so I think it's a fair application to say if we are to be the salt of the earth, we need to be pure people. Purity is power. And I've always believed that. Purity is power. You want to be a force that God can use, live a pure life. Purity is power, but the opposite is also true. Impurity leaves us powerless. If we have sin harbored in our lives, then we are not making ourselves effective for God to use us. We've got to be pure. We've got to be pure in heart. In fact, James said in James 1:27 that pure religion looks like this. What does he say? Visit the widows, take care of the orphans, and live a life unspotted before the world. So I think if we're to be the salt of the earth, it begins with us being pure. Pure in heart, as we've already talked about, and being pure in our life. Another thing about salt, as I mentioned a minute ago, is the flavor aspect. We put salt on our food because it makes it taste better. If that's the case, then think about this. The world is bland without salt. Just like eating a baked potato with nothing on it is boring, the world is boring without Christians. If we're the salt of the earth, imagine if there were no Christians in life. Now, some people have the opposite thought. They say, oh, if I become a Christian, I can't have any fun. If I become a Christian, life's going to be boring. I think the opposite is true. I think a life spent with Christ and the freedom we have in Christ, I think life led by the Spirit, lived to the fullest, is the best way to live life. Jesus says, I came that your joy might be full. I came to give you life and that more abundantly. I came to give a peace that surpasses all understanding. And what do we find from people outside the church? Peace and joy and happiness. What we see from people outside the church is people turn into every substance, every relationship, every temporary high, trying to push down the bad feelings within them because they're continuing to live life apart from their Creator. People outside the church are trying to say, how much entertainment and amusement can I cram in my life to deaden the senses that are telling me that I need to get right? They lay their head on their pillow at night, ashamed of who they are apart from Christ, and so they drink themselves to sleep, or they take pills to take the edge off, or they spend time doing things they know they shouldn't be doing because they know deep down they are not who they are supposed to be. I believe a life spent with Christ is the best way to live. And I believe that if all the Christians were subtracted from the world, this place would be pretty bland. It would be pretty boring. I believe we season this world. I believe that we are the most loving, the most generous people in the world. Time and time again, when statistics come out on this topic, you find out that the most philanthropic, the most generous people are the Christians. Places like the American Red Cross, they do a lot of good. The Salvation Army, they do a lot of good. But you find the ones, and the Salvation Army is a Christian organization, but you find the ones that do the most good worldwide are always faith-based. It's always the Southern Baptist Convention and the Crisis Ministry. It's always those not-for-profits that put Jesus Christ at the top of what they do. You find the most generous, loving people in the world, they're always the Christians. That's not to say that non-Christians aren't generous, don't get me wrong. It's not to say they don't give their money and donate blood and do other good things. But by and large, Christians do it from a different kind of spirit. We season this world as the salt of the earth. Imagine if we weren't here. Would the world be any different? our community look like if every Bible-preaching church just disappeared? Would things get better or would things get worse? I would hope to say things would get worse. Not that I'm pulling for things to get worse, but we're speaking hypothetically here. If we disappeared, would our community get darker or lighter? Would it get better or worse? If the church is being the church it's supposed to be, then we make an impact in our community. The problem these days, in my humble opinion, is that the church has become so much like the world that instead of us salting the earth, we're allowing the world to assault us. Instead of us adding flavor to the world, we become so much like the world that no one can even tell the difference. You can go in the average church on a Sunday morning and not hear Jesus elevated. It's all man-centered. It's not about the cross. It's not about the blood. And the churches are not offering the community anything. Or else we're trying to be so much like what the community says. We're trying to save the planet, and we're trying to recycle and go green, and we're trying to take on illiteracy, and we're trying to fight poverty, which those are all good things. But we're not giving them the number one thing that they need. We're not giving the lost world what will save their souls for all eternity. We're fighting the wrong battles many times. And if we go away, I'm not so sure the world would get that much worse. And I don't mean we as in us. I'm just speaking generically. But ask yourself that. What would happen if I went away? Would my office be a better place? Would my school be a better place? Or would it be worse off because of us? We've got to be the salt that seasons this bland world. What's another thing that salt does? You ever get it in an open wound? How's that feel? Sometimes you don't know you have a cut till you go to the beach and you get out in that salt water, right? And then you feel it. When salt gets in an open wound, it stings. It has a burning sensation. In the same way, if we were to be the salt of the earth, we should prick the collective conscience of the world around us. You ever heard somebody say, I just feel uncomfortable around that person? You know, whenever they come in a room, I feel like they're judging me. They're probably not judging anybody. You just have a guilty conscience, right? You say, oh, they're always stepping on my toes. They're just living life. Right? We're not trying to point our fingers at anybody. We're just trying to live. And if somebody feels convicted or guilty around us, that's because of sin in their life, not because of us. And as we live the Christian life, it will prick the hearts and the consciousness of those around us. Those who practice the works of the flesh always feel guilty around those who practice the fruit of the Spirit. This does not mean that we are judgmental. It just means that we're trying to point people to the cross. Salt also makes people thirsty. You eat something salty and you want something to drink, right? One of the good benefits of salt, why we put it on food, is people don't get enough water. And so if we salt our food, we might find ourselves drinking more water than we would have on our own. Salt makes people thirsty. Well, if that's the case, and to be the salt of the earth means that we should make this world thirsty for the things of God. We should make them say, I want some of that to satisfy. And what did Jesus call himself? Living water. Right? He offered that woman, that Samaritan woman at the well. He says, if you drink the water that I offer you, you will never be thirsty again. We need people to realize that they're thirsty. We need them to acknowledge the fact that they're being spiritually dehydrated, that their organs are beginning to shrivel up, and if they don't get water soon, that they're going to perish. We need them to understand they need Jesus more than they need their next breath of oxygen. We need them to understand they need God. And we have the opportunity to do that when we're the salt of the earth. We need people that are unsaved to look at us and say, there's something different about that person. I can't put my finger on it, but I want what that person has. I want what she has. I want what he has. And then we can tell them, it's Christ in me. Salt is pure. It seasons things. It adds good flavor. Salt makes us thirsty. It stings an open wound. But I think when Jesus said, you're the salt of the earth, here's what I think he had in mind more than anything else. I think Jesus was thinking about preservation, because that's what salt was most commonly used for. That's why it was so important. They didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have freezers. And so if you have an animal that dies, and you've got all this meat, you've either got to eat it right away, or else you have to find a way to preserve it. You kill a deer, you kill a cow, you kill a hog, and you're filling your deep freezer with all of that meat. And you can say, man, this can last me all year. Well, they couldn't do that. And so salt, if it was packed all around meat, would preserve it, it would last a whole lot longer. So think about the financial implications of salt. We've got this whole goat or this whole lamb, and if we don't eat it today, it spoils, but because of this salt, we can stretch this and make it last a whole lot longer. It was so valuable to them. When Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth," I think everybody's mind did not go to flavor, didn't go to the color, it didn't go to making a wound sting. When he said, "You're the salt of the earth," I believe they all thought about preservation, about being something that can preserve. See, Satan wants to spoil this world, and he does it through perversion. He does it through sin. He tried to spoil it by making Adam and Eve sin. This world is being spoiled, but you and I have the opportunity to preserve it. We do that when we influence people for Christ. Every unconverted sinner that we take to the cross, every person who's dead in their sins and trespasses who we see saved, every time we rescue one from the flames, as Jude said, we are helping to preserve this world. We are like preserving agents that Jesus spoke of. Salt is important, but if it is not doing its job, it's worthless. What's the point of salt if you sprinkle it on your food and it doesn't make your food taste any better? What's the point of salt if you pack your meat but it doesn't have that quality, that doesn't preserve your meat? Jesus says it's good for nothing and it would be thrown out. That's exactly what they would do, by the way. Around the Dead Sea area, which I mentioned a minute ago, being heavily filled with salt. Around the Dead Sea area, a lot of salt today has been found to be contaminated by gypsum and other minerals. And when that gypsum gets into the salt, it loses its taste. It either becomes flat or else it even has a disgusting taste to it altogether. So imagine you're in your home and you sprinkle some salt on your food. You say, "Oh man, this salt is terrible." Well, what are you going to do with it? Jesus says the only thing left to do is just to throw it out. But if you're not careful and you throw salt out and it gets all in your garden, it's going to kill all of your plants. It's going to kill your flowers. It's going to kill your crops. So they would throw their salt out, but they were very careful to make sure that they kept it only on the roadways and the paths. So that as people walked over that salt, it would eventually just grind up and disappear altogether. That's what Jesus meant when he says it's good for nothing but to be thrown out and cast under the foot of men. Christians, if we are not being the salt that we've been called to be, then we are not fulfilling our calling. So are you pure? Are you making the world thirst for Christ? Are you convicting the world's conscience as they get around you? Are you adding flavor to this bland world? Jesus says you are the salt of the earth. But next, in verse 14, we looked at it and he says you are the light of the world. So let's talk about that light and then we'll close. When we're the salt, the world certainly takes notice, but that's something that's kind of hard for the world to put their finger on, that there's something different about you kind of thing. But when we let our light shine, it's much more different. See, light cannot be hidden, can it? In fact, that's by definition, light is simply the absence of dark, the absence of darkness. You know, light is not some tangible thing that we can define or put our hands on. Light just means there's no darkness here. And so when we are the light of the world, everybody knows it. Light cannot hide because it pierces the darkness and it exposes those things which try to remain hidden. That's why Jesus says men hate the light. They love the darkness because their deeds are evil, and the light exposes all the evil things. So when we walk into a room, we should immediately light it up when we come in. And that's the reason why unsaved people, by and large, don't want to be around Christians. Because we walk in a room, the light shines on their sin. So when you walk in the room and they were telling dirty jokes or they were using foul language, when you come in the room, they immediately freeze up. Not anything you did. You're just shining your light. When we went to Hilton Head the other week, when that conference y'all sent us to, and Alicia and I met, it's a long story we won't get into, but we met this couple and we talked to them for a while. And just through the course of us talking, this man started dropping the F word, and he's like, "Oh, excuse my language, don't mean to curse." Like, "Hey, it's fine." And he had cursed several times. Well, then later said, "What are you doing in Hilton Head?" And one of my friends said, "I'm here at a pastor's conference. I'm a Southern Baptist pastor." This guy had been. I didn't want to make him uncomfortable. I don't try to do that. Anytime you tell someone you're a pastor, it's, "Oh, well, praise the Lord, God bless you, see you later." People, it's a conversation killer. If you ever want to get out of a conversation, tell someone you're a pastor. So he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm here for a conference." Just my wife got to come with me. He said, "Oh yeah, that's cool." And so we talked for a little bit. Well, then we got back to our hotel, And they were at the same hotel that we were at. And so Alicia didn't know that I had said it to him, and so they got to talking, and Alicia said something about me being a pastor here for the pastor's conference, and he said, what? He said, your husband's a pastor? He said, I'm out here cursing in front of him. And so I was parking the car when I came in. He said, man, you didn't tell me you were a pastor. And I said, I didn't want to embarrass you, man. It's okay. He's like, no, I'm sorry for my language. I'm so sorry. I said, I didn't bat an eye, blush, or anything. But he found out I was a pastor. He was immediately convicted about the language that he used. Why? Because I'm pointing my finger saying, come on, man, put a bar of soap in your mouth. I didn't say a word to him. But he hears pastor, and his first thought was, 10 minutes ago I was saying a cuss word. When light walks into a room, it exposes the darkness. And so that's just something that would naturally happen. I'm not going out of my way to try to make anybody feel guilty, or not, that's not what I'm about doing. But it's a natural result. As we let our light so shine, it pierces through the darkness. Jesus says that's why they hate the light. They'd rather continue committing their deeds in darkness. But it's a natural result. In Genesis 1, 3, and 4, the Bible tells us that God made light, and he separated the light from the darkness, and he's been doing that ever since. Light and darkness, they don't coexist. There's a place where they collide sometimes, and it makes shadows, but by and large, light and dark have been separated from day one. We're separate today as the light. We're separate from the dark. We walk in the light, the world walks in the dark. We're different. We live separate lives. So many Christians today, though, spend most of their time in the dark, and that they don't have much to offer. We can be the light of the world because Jesus is the light of the world. He said so in John 8, verse 12. So think about it like this. As the light of the world, we are really more like the moon than we are like the sun. The moon is not a source of light. It does not give off its own light, as you probably remember from school. But what does the moon do? It reflects the light from the sun. So at night, we look up and we have the light of the moon to guide us so that we can see. But the moon's not giving off light, it's simply reflecting it. And that's what we're called to do. We don't produce this magical light within us. We only reflect the light from the Son of God, Jesus Christ. He is the light, and we are reflections of him. How do we be his reflection? Through our good works, through the things that we do, through the way that we live. When we obey the Bible, when we say, I'm going to live my life like Christ, we become the light of the world as we reflect him. It makes us, what Jesus said here, a city on a hill. A shining city on a hill that cannot be hidden. When I was first a youth pastor back in the late 90s or whatever, early 2000s, or 2004, I guess. But back in those days, everybody was naming their youth groups. That was the cool thing to do. And so I wanted our youth group to be called the City on a Hill, based on this verse. I thought it was an awesome name. Nobody liked it. They voted it down. And so, but I always wanted that to be, if I'm ever a youth pastor, I'm going to call our group the City on a Hill. Never got to do that, by the way. I'm over it now. But I always thought that would be a really cool name for a group, because think about what that implies. And I did a whole message on it, and they still didn't like it. But just imagine a city that's on top of a hill, and everybody looks up, and they can see it from miles and miles around. A city that is up on a hill cannot be hidden. And Jesus says that's what we are to be as the church. And they all kept saying, but we're not on a hill. And I was like, no, it's symbolic, you see. Where it's like we're up on a hill, and they just didn't get it. But I hope we understand that today, that it is as if we are a city up on a hill. And from miles around, people see us. We can't hide it. We're not trying to hide it. We're not trying to be obnoxious, but we're not trying to blend into the world. We're just supposed to be who Jesus created us to be and let the world take notice. The Puritan preacher, John Winthrop, on board his ship heading for Massachusetts, preached a message to the Puritans on board in the year 1630. Here's what he said. We must consider that we shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work which we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. Winthrop understood that the new nation, that they were sailing away from England to create, he understood that the eyes of the entire world would be on this new nation. What was so unique about it? Had nothing to do with the Constitution or separation of powers or limited government. That stuff wouldn't come for another 100 years. But they understood that they were sailing away from the Anglican church that told people what church to go to, what to believe, how to worship. And if you didn't go to church, you couldn't own property, you couldn't hold down a job. So we're going to leave that behind, and we're going to go to a place that we don't tell anybody how to worship. We don't tell anybody what church to go to. We don't tell anybody what book to read. We don't force anybody to attend our services. And they said, we're going to start from scratch, and we're going to make a place that is purely free to worship God. And we know the whole world is going to have their eyes on us. And if we fail, we'll just become a story and a byword around the world. Hey, yeah, remember that whole thing where they tried to sail off, and yeah, how'd that work out for them? He says, but if we are diligent, if we do what we know is right, then we will be a shining city on a hill for the whole world to see. And we can look back to what they did in 1630, and I think we can say they were pretty successful in what they did. President John F. Kennedy understood that, and he built on that same premise in one of his speeches. Ronald Reagan, the night before his first inauguration, gave a speech where he called America a city on a hill, and in his famous farewell address to the nation, he said once again that America is that shining city on a hill. People that have understood that American exceptionalism, they've always believed that God put America here and blessed America so that the rest of the world can see. And whether that's capitalism, whether that's democracy, whatever you want to make that, that's fine. But theologically speaking, spiritually speaking, I believe that God allowed America to succeed, to give people a land where they could worship Him in absolute freedom. And people around the world have put their eyes on this place, and they've always known that there's something really different, really unique. It's a city on a hill. It cannot be hidden. We're not the largest country, not the most populated country. But if I can just speak to a bunch of Americans tonight here and say, I think this is the best one there's ever been. And I know that I'm proud to be an American. And I'm grateful for that because of the freedom that we have here. But we understand symbolically what Reagan understood, what Kennedy understood, what Winthrop understood, is what Jesus was saying 2,000 years ago, that we are to be a city on a hill. And if we do that, people are going to be looking at us. So what do they say when they look up on this hill and see our city? Do they see hypocrisy? Do they see patterns of sin in our life? Or do they see Jesus through us? Do they see good works? Do they see us living like Jesus, loving our neighbor, and leading people to the Father? That's what they need to see. Just as a city on a hill cannot be hidden, Jesus says, neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, put it under a basket. It doesn't make any sense. Light a candle, cover it up, right? So people don't do that. Instead, they display it to give light to all that are in the house. I know we have electricity. Doesn't quite mean the same to us, but what happens when the power goes out? We run for those kerosene lamps. We run for those candles. We want to put just the smallest flicker of fire in the middle of our house, and when it's completely dark, a simple candle can light up the room. We're not going to be bumping into each other. We're not going to be crashing into the walls because of a tiny little flicker of light, and it gives light to all that are in the house. Jesus says we don't light our light and then hide it, but we display it on a lampstand. We put it up for all to see, and that's what He has called us to do. So when we were kids, we sang that great song, This Little Light of Mine. I'm going to let it shine. And as simple as that is, we're not going to let Satan it out. Y'all know how it goes. But we're going to let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. And let that be the mantra of the church. We stop singing that, when we graduate out of children's church sometimes, but let us never lose that application. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Let it shine until Jesus comes. I'm going to let it shine. And if we do that, then the world is going to not glorify us, Jesus said, but they will glorify our Father in heaven. I want to close by reading a quote from Mother Teresa. It's a little bit longer than just a simple quote, but bear with me here. On this whole concept of salt and light, Mother Teresa spoke at the presidential prayer breakfast back in the 90s when Bill Clinton was in office. And so the author of this book, he says, lighting the night is about having a life so well lived that it's hard to deny the validity of what you say about Jesus and His claims. At the presidential prayer breakfast, Mother Teresa got up to speak to a group of believers, And yet behind her, if you've ever seen the prayer breakfast, was Al Gore and his wife Tipper, and on the other side was Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary. So she gets up to speak, and she says these words: I feel that the greatest destroyer of peace today is abortion, because it is a war against the child, a direct killing of the innocent child, murder by the mother herself. By abortion, the mother does not learn to love, but kills even her own child to solve her problems. And by abortion, the father is told that he does not have to take any responsibility at all for the child he has brought into the world. The father is likely to put other women into the same trouble, so abortion just leads to more abortion. And then she said, any country that accepts abortion is not teaching its people to love, but to use any violence to get what they want. This is why the greatest destroyer of love and peace is abortion. When she finished those words, she got a standing ovation from everyone in the room except the 4 people sitting behind her. As you know, the Clintons have been some of the strongest supporters of abortion since their time in the 90s. When Bill Clinton got up to speak, he said, it's hard to argue with a life so well lived. The world's most powerful advocate of abortion had little to say in the face of a life characterized by the compelling outcome of good works. And then the author of this book goes on to say that Mother Teresa's words carried more weight as a result of her good works. I love what Bill Clinton, who's known as Slick Willie because he's always quick on his feet, says it's hard to argue with a life so well lived. He didn't agree with what she was saying, but he had to stop and say, well, she is Mother Teresa after all. No one can argue the fact that she was salt of the earth. She was a light to the world. I don't agree theologically with everything Mother Teresa believed in, but that's not the point. She backed up what she said. She let her light so shine, and people saw her good works. And when the man who signed partial birth abortion into law sits here while she chastises him for allowing women to kill their children, the only thing he can say is, kind of hard to argue with her because of her good works. Hard to argue with her because she lets her light so shine. Hard to argue with her because she is the salt of the earth. And so we may disagree, but kind of have to tip your cap to her is more or less what Bill Clinton was saying. And if we live our lives that way, the world may disagree with us, and they may not like our Christ, but let's put them in a position where they at least say, yeah, I don't agree with all that stuff, but I gotta say, at least she practices what she preaches. At least he is not a hypocrite. At least they really do what they say they believe. At least they really show love. At least they really go out of their way to make a difference. At least they really are generous. At least they're good people. When we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world, they may reject our message, but there's nothing that they can say about us. Best case scenario, though, they see our good works, and then they glorify our Father in heaven. So I always talk about salvation. It's not based on works. We don't do good works to be saved, but this is why we do good works once we have been saved. Because if we don't let our light so shine, then how else are they going to glorify our Father? How else are they going to see him through us? I know it was a long message tonight. Thank you for bearing with me. Would you please rise to your feet as we're going to conclude? Yes, ma'am, if you want to. I appreciate it. Tonight, though, maybe you see that there is something in your life that you need to do to be better salt, to be better light. Remember what we said at the beginning, that we are the salt and light, but it's really up to us whether or not we choose to be effective, whether we choose to shine our light, whether we choose to salt this earth. Is there something you need to do to better be the salt and light tonight? Lord, I pray that if there is something that you've challenged us to do, convicted us to be more the salt and light you want us to be, Lord, if there's something that's preventing us from doing it, some sin we're holding on to, I pray that we would forsake that, repent of it. And Lord, if there's something we need to proactively do to be more the people you've called us to be, Lord, I pray that we would do that as well. Help us to obey you, to be obedient, to follow through with anything you may lay on our heart tonight. So Lord, I ask this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. If you want to come to the altar, please do. Pray where you are. Use this opportunity if God has led you.